Hello and welcome to this video on the joints of the human body. The skeletal joints, not the other kind. The joints that make your body not just mobile but posable are important to movement, actions and even living to some extent. What is considered a joint may surprise you as it covers a fairly wide number of things. There are 6 definitive joint categories spread across different points in your body. These are ball and socket, pivot, hinge, saddle, plane, and condyloid joints. These are further defined by whether they are fibrous, cartilaginous, or synovial. Functionally, we classify them on the degree of movement that they allow, and this is where you get your 3 types of joint: movable, immovable, or at least partly movable, and then completely movable joints. By having the 3 different types, you can then look at what happens in terms of how they're structured. This is where things begin to get more complicated, let's say. Immovable joints are basically permanently fused bones, and they're nearly always fibrous joints. Because they're immovable, they're largely intended to provide a degree of structural certainty. For example, positioning between 2 bones so they always remain in relatively constant connection, or at least parallel or similar to each other. Partly movable joints are what allow for some degree of movement, and mostly made up of bones that have cartilage between them. These, for example, include things like your vertebrae, where your back has to bend, but you don't want your back to be able to move freely, or else things like your rib cage won't be able to stay where you need to stay. Your torso won't be able to remain upright, and there are all sorts of other issues. And then you have your movable joints. These are what allow you to move freely. So, for example, if you want to gesture, speaking for instance, the jaw, all of these are considered movable joints. In terms of the first of these, we have the effectively immovable joints, or what are immovable joints, but it's why they're immovable that is important. They're nearly always bound up in tight, fibrous, and very tough tissue. They're intended to provide a lot of rigidity and strength and be stable over anything that happens. Now this is further divided into 3 more categories, so this is almost like babushka dolls in that you get more and more detail the more you go down. The subclassifications are going to be sutures, gomophyses, and syndesmoses. The sutures are completely immovable, and they're only ever really found in flat plate-like bones, so basically your skull, and to an extent your pelvis over time. Then you have your gomophyses. These are also a form of immovable joint, and they're found where something bone-like has to be able to articulate to a certain extent. So, for example, where your teeth sit, their sockets are considered gomophyses. Then you have the syndesmoses. These are slightly movable, and they're slightly more complicated, and we'll get into those as we go further into the video. After this, we have your cartilaginous joints. Now, these are actually much easier to understand, mostly because they're made up of fibrous cartilage and hyaline cartilage. From these, you have your synchondroses and you have your symphyses. Your synchondroses are your called primary cartilaginous joints, and your symphyses are secondary cartilaginous joints. In terms of the synchondroses, the bones are connected by hyaline cartilage, and so the bones themselves, or at least the joints, are immovable. Whereas your symphyseal joints are where the bones are connected by a certain amount of fibrous cartilage, and this allows for some movement. Now, the latter of these can be well demonstrated by, say, the spine, whereas in the other instance, the hyaline cartilage provides a degree of, absolute immunity to any kind of movement. A simple and easily understood example of this is, say, the sternum and the rib cage. You don't want your ribs being able to detach from the sternum, and so the hyaline cartilage allows the sternum, which is a bone, to connect to the other bones, which are your ribs, but there is a certain amount of movement from the ribs at the back, but the actual connection between the ribs and the sternum doesn't move. Now we have the far more familiar kinds of joints, your synovial joints, and these are almost entirely defined by the fact that there is a small fluid-filled sac or cavity that is contained within a fibrous capsule. This is not only there to provide lubrication to the moving joint, but also to ensure that the cartilage that covers the top of each bone is continuously supplied with the necessary nutrient and waste is removed for the various chondrocytes within to not just have new nutrition going in, but to remove their waste and ensure that the cartilage is always replaced. And therefore, unless you have arthritis or some other similar condition, it is repaired and you don't have pain or problems with the joint moving. These joints are pretty much freely movable, and so they are one of the most common kinds found in the body. You can basically look at it as anything that's not in the very core of your body, that being the spine, the rib cage, and the skull, are going to be one of these kinds of joints. In terms of synovial joints, there is the hinge, saddle, plane, pivot, condyloid, and ball and socket. Hinge joints are fairly straightforward. Just the same as a hinge on a door, these allow for movement in just one plane or one direction. Typically speaking, it'll be flexion and extension. So just the same way you can only open and shut a door, you can't lift and put down a door, you can really only open and shut or flexion and extension of these joints. Saddles are a little more complicated because, as the name would suggest, they're almost like an arch, but they're an arch with a slight concave to it. This allows for the movement of the bone or the joint in a way that goes, say, left to right, but also slightly backwards and forwards. Your thumb is a very simple example of the saddle joint, as it can move freely up and down, but your thumb also has a small amount of side-to-side movement on top of that. A plane is another kind, and it's again a relatively less common example, where you have two surfaces that slide over one another. There aren't many of these, and the subtabular joint is probably one of the easiest and simplest examples. The subtabular joint is one of the joints in your foot, and it's more or less where your ankle becomes attached to the flat part of your foot. And what it does is ensure a certain amount of movement from the way the leg is and the ankle over the foot itself, so that you can always have a certain amount of direct downwards pressure onto the foot itself. This allows the human body to always transmit the force of walking or running and other movement using the foot in the right way. Pivot joints are rather more straightforward again, and they're getting increasingly common. This is a joint that only allows for rotation, which is particularly useful for most of our extremities. So for example, if you want to move your arm, so if you look at your elbow, that would be a kind of pivot joint, mostly because it has lots of ligament tissues, or you have the radius and ulna. Both of these are examples of pivots. The condyloid joints are the next, and these are very useful in terms of our dexterity as a species. They are going to contain a sort of concave surface, and within that you sort of fit a opposing concave, although it's more like a cup, but not quite as let's say, advanced or extensive as a ball and socket joint. They're also sometimes called ellipsoid joints, so your wrist is an example of this, where by having the ability to rock inside that relatively shallow dish, you can move your wrist backwards and forwards, and to an extent left and right. The last kind of synovial joint is ball and socket, and this is exactly as the name says. You have a ball-like structure that fits into a very deep socket, or at least in terms of bone structure, quite deep. The necessity of this is that it provides a fair amount of freedom, but it also provides a lot of structural integrity around it. Understand that these aren't necessarily the strongest of joints, because your shoulder, for example, is easily dislocated, but by contrast your hip is very, very solid, and it all has to do with the size of the socket and the size of the ball that goes into it. Now we need to talk about the kinds of movement that are available. We've briefly touched on them, particularly with regards to things like saddle joints and hinge joints, but there are different kinds of movement available. The first two are simply flexion and extension. This is again allowing for sagittal plane, or what is basically the up and down movement of your body. Essentially, if you put your arm directly out in front of you so that it sits at 90 degrees, that's a form of flexion. Extension is when you bring it back towards your body. So if you look at it this way, where you have your arm going out, that is flexion, because the muscles are getting shorter. Whereas once you bring it back to the center line where the muscles are relaxed, they've extended out to their full length because they're now completely relaxed. Circumduction is the next, and circumduction is essentially just rolling your head. That's the easiest example. The rest of your body remains relatively stationary, while your head rolls in a circle, for example, when a child sighs at you, or similar. Other examples are when you're entertaining yourself, and your right-hand girlfriend is, playing their part. This is an example of circumduction. Supination and pronation are all down to the forearm, and it's when your arm is sitting at your side, and you have your palm facing upwards. This is supinated position. Supination meaning facing upwards. Pronation is when you turn so that the palm of your hand is facing downwards. The next are dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. Both of these are very similar in nature to things like pronation and supination. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion are focusing rather than on the hand, on the feet. Plantar flexion is when you're looking at your foot and whether or not the foot is facing towards the ground, or if you're trying to face it upwards, and to a certain extent you can only go so far with this. Dorsiflexion is when you raise the front of the foot, so basically your toes, upwards and try and bend them towards your leg. On the other side of this, you have plantar flexion. That is when you are trying to bend your foot downwards. So if, for example, you were stretching your leg out as far as you can in front of you, this would be an example of plantar flexion, as the toes are trying to be pushed down towards the ground as much as you can while your leg remains straight. Next we have inversion and eversion. Now, these involve multiple different kinds of planes of movement at the same time, which is where they get to be a little more complicated. The simplest way to think of inversion is when you're trying to rotate, say, your foot so that it faces towards the midline of your body. That is, if you draw a line from the very top middle of your head all the way down to the ground. If you were to try and rotate your foot so that the foot has an angle where it's facing towards that midline, that is inversion. Whereas if you're trying to force it so it faces away from you, that is eversion. These movements are rather important in terms of the ability to travel freely. The human body has to have these in order to, for example, have a stable footing when walking, particularly over rough terrain. Or if you're running and you need to transmit the force from the very front of your foot, where the ball of your big toe is, through to the heel and then up the leg. The last kind of movement we need to talk about are protraction and retraction. These are similar in some ways to others we've mentioned already, particularly thinking here of flexion and extension, but they are distinct and different. Protraction is when you are trying to essentially pull your body forwards, but we're not talking about your arms, but rather the actual torso and abdomen. It's mostly considered in terms of shoulder motion and your shoulder blades or scapula. So protraction is when you're shrugging your shoulders forward, whereas retraction is when you're trying to pull your shoulders back. For example, if you're trying to push your chest out. These are the kinds of joints across the human body. Not only what makes them up, but what defines them, and then how they're used in different kinds of movement. It's rather important to understand that not only do we have these joints, but they're essential to much of what we do on a day-to-day basis. To use a simple example, the ability of the human body to breathe is partly done by muscles. That is, you have the diaphragm. The diaphragm provides a pressure gradient, moving air in and out, but it's also supported, particularly during forced breathing, with the rib cage. If the rib cage didn't have the necessary joints along the spine that allow the ribs to move in the correct way, that is allowing the rib cage to expand and contract, you wouldn't necessarily be able to breathe, but they need to be fixed on the other side, and that's where the sternum is. The sternum provides for exactly that degree of rigidity and connection. There's just that little bit of give in it that allows them to flex just a little bit, meaning that you can expand the thoracic cavity. Another example would be during, say, a pregnancy, where the joint between the two hip bones is made in such a way that it can move and widen, allowing for the passage of a expected baby, rather than having to try and open up their belly of a pregnant woman, or, in worst case scenario, try and force out a very large baby out of a much narrower gap that it's just not fit for. This is actually a problem that we observe with, say, pit bulls or bulldogs, where their heads are just too big for the mother to be able to give birth to, and therefore cesareans are necessary. Thankfully, the human body has not had that problem, at least for now. Big-headed children are getting increasingly common, and so we may be forced at some point to have to worry about it. Overall, different kinds of motion are limited in part by the kind of joints that are involved, but also those same joints are spread across different parts of the body for different reasons. Some are better, some are worse, and some, although they do the job, are certainly not what you would think was the best choice. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.